Well, the unexpected things are always the most interesting. I'm excited to be able to moderate a second session, and a second session by one of my favorite scholars, Erika Doss, whom we have known for quite some time. This is not her first time in Lublin. Erika is one of the best-known art historians working on American art, and we first heard about Erika when we read her book on Benton and Pollock and politics of modernism, and we've been following your work, and we were so glad that you responded. You actually learned about our conference, right, and contacted us, and then we knew we had to have you here. So we are delighted. You know, Erika is a professor of American art at Notre Dame, but currently she is a fellow at Stanford, also a school that is well known to me because I was a Fulbright lecturer, visiting professor at Stanford many years ago. That's when I did my own work on Cage. A perfect environment to do research, right? Concentrate on your work and make trips around the world, right? Erika's biography is extensive. You can read about it here. So. But most of you know who Erika Doss is, so please, Erika, come to the lectern, and here's your talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I want to thank Jurek and Edyta and Robert for organizing this conference, and I want to thank the Terra Foundation very much for their generous funding of this and many other conferences that they've been putting on across Europe. I really think this is a fantastic idea. So thank you, and I'm happy to be here. So I thought I would share a little bit of a current project that I'm working on today, and without further ado, I thought I would start with sort of some frameworks about how we might reckon with visual artists and the literary, as this conference aims to do. I think this yields the possibilities of several different models or approaches for scholarly consideration. Just in terms of the modern 20th century art of the United States, there are at least 3 paradigms with which we might consider the meaning and the significance of the words and writing of American visual artists. The first is the narrative paradigm of artists like Thomas Hart Benton, whose rambling 1937 autobiography tells the story of being an artist in America and segues neatly with the rambling and rambunctious style of storytelling in his representational modern art that he developed in the 1920s and 1930s, such as the America Today mural, recently restored and exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, although, as Edyta pointed out yesterday, novelist Sinclair Lewis remarked in one review, "Oh, here is a rare thing, a painter who can write," Benton's book, which became a bestseller, was actually not that rare. Other American artists, including sculptor Janet Scudder, painter John Sloan, printmaker Rockwell Kent, painter Jerome Myers, also published autobiographies during the interwar era, and post-war biographies by artists as different as Norman Rockwell. This is Rockwell's My Adventures as an Illustrator, and Man Ray's self-portrait. These were both readable and fairly popular. I think they were even covered with the Saturday Review of Books selection options that you could get for subscribing to that magazine. A second approach to the subject of the artist-writer is the polemical paradigm. Benton wrote extensively on any number of subjects, so much so that he became the selected spokesman for Parker fountain pens in the 1940s, as we see in this wonderful 1946 ad from the hand of Thomas Hart Benton. Likewise, as Jerzy Kutnik has explained, Robert Motherwell was an exceptionally gifted wordsmith whose theoretically engaged writings significantly contributed to the intellectual and affective climate of post-war abstract expressionism. Here we see Motherwell in his 1945 New York studio, note the photograph of French writer Charles Baudelaire pinned to the bulletin board on the left. No, yes, thank you. Barnett Newman was also a voracious writer whose 1940s essays like The Plasmic Image and The Sublime Is Now were similarly engaged in providing an intellectual framework for emergent forms of post-war American abstraction, including, of course, his own. A third model is the journalistic paradigm, the diaristic and generally private note-making of artists such as Joseph Cornell and Agnes Pelton. Before turning to this subject and to these particular artists, let me add that these suggested artist-writer paradigms are not intended to be reductive or even definitive. Artist handbooks and technical guides, like this one by Reginald Marsh, or also the 1957 guide by Chaim Gross, The Technique of Wood Sculpture, which was a big influence on a lot of post-war American sculptors, including, for example, Dwayne Hansen. And artist-run magazines like Reality, a journal of artist opinions. This was published from 1953 to 1955, and of course Transformation, published from 1950 to 1952, as Rachel Stella discussed. And artist words and interviews, like the Art News series, So-and-So Paints a Picture, that ran in the 1940s and 1950s, and then the interviews that Franz Klein and many other artists did that James Finch just discussed earlier today. All of this features in this scholarship. Moreover, these categories can overlap and blur. The narrative paradigm, for example, is often and obviously polemical. Likewise, words sometimes get in the way of the visual evidence. Here I note in particular Benton's adamant assertion that he was not a modern American artist, his words thus contradicting the look and the style of what I have long argued is a decidedly modern style of American painting. Just as often, critics have chosen to ignore or neglect artist words. Discussing Newman's paintings in a 1958 catalog essay, for example, Clement Greenberg stated, "There is no program, no polemic in these paintings. They do not intend to make a point, let alone shock or startle." Insisting on a model of modernism that was, as he put it, uninflated by, quote, illegitimate content, no religion or mysticism or political certainties, Greenberg's formalist and visually centered art criticism utterly disavowed Newman's own writing and thinking about these paintings and his own explicit statements about their intended transcendental meaning and content. In a new book I'm writing on modern American artists and religion, I have found artist words, and in particular their journals and their diaries, to be enormously helpful in terms of deciphering particular religious concepts and concerns that may be hidden or veiled in their visual work, and hard for outsiders to recognize and understand. And this is, in fact, I think, the role that these materials actually and originally played for these artists, and thus our attention to them, from their historical recovery to our critical interpretation, is highly significant for future directions in American art history itself. And in this regard, I'd like to thank the Archives of American Art for their increasing focus on digitalizing these materials. This is truly changing the scope and reach of the field. I mean, I like going to Washington and I like spending hours at the Archives of American Art, but I really like just browsing through the digitalization, the digitalized materials, including all of the Joseph Cornell papers. It's been a godsend, and I want to thank the Archives, and I understand the Terra Foundation has been very supportive, and thank them as well. As per my topic, I'm interested in Kandinsky's 1911 prompt toward the spiritual in art, and how many American moderns in the early to mid 20th century aimed to make spiritually resonant forms of modern art that transcended solely secular, material, and commercial meaning. Translated into English in 1914, Kandinsky's book was widely read and identified by numerous American artists, including Marston Hartley, Georgia O'Keeffe, Alfred Stieglitz, Marcel Duchamp, as extremely influential. I'm further interested in religion's general absence in the history of modern American art, particularly as certain American moderns were in fact religious. So my project centers on case studies of American artists who were viewed as modernist during their careers and were also adherents of particular religions. Assemblage artist Joseph Cornell, who was Christian Science. Non-objective painter Mark Tobey, who was a follower of Baha'i. Symbolist painter Agnes Pelton, who was a theosophist and also practiced Agni Yoga. Abstract expressionist Mark Rothko, who was Jewish. And pop artist Andy Warhol, who was Catholic. Their selection is based on their stylistic and religious diversity. My project is intended as a focused consideration rather than a general overview of the linked subjects of modern art and religion in 20th century America. In fact, my selection of canonical American moderns, such as Warhol and Rothko, highlights, in fact, how religious beliefs have generally been ignored in discussions of their art. Aiming to enrich understandings of American modernism by considering the visual, material, and affective conditions of faith, my project further aims to unpack why religion was largely excluded in the history of modern American art, as that history was written by historians, curators, and critics from the early through the mid-20th century. And while my project focuses on American artists, the questions it raises about the interplay of modern art and religion have, I think, global reach. Now, to be clear, my project centers on modern American artists who were religious, not religious artists who lived in modern times. A crucial distinction of focus and priorities. To be religious is to believe in a transcendent reality and for some to follow the tenets of a particular religion or religious institution. To be a religious artist is to illustrate, affirm, and proselytize on behalf of certain religions. Widely recognized American religious artists of the past century include Warner Sallman, a Protestant fundamentalist and commercial illustrator whose Aryan-centric Head of Christ that we see here has been reproduced an estimated 500 million times. And you may recognize Thomas Kinkade, the phenomenally popular evangelical Christian painter, the painter of light, as he was called. In the 1990s, Kinkade was represented by some 350 galleries and 5,000 retail outlets, which sold 20 million copies of his inspirational prints, idealized landscapes accompanied by verses from the Bible that the artist described as, quote, vignettes to inspire the mind and soothe the soul. And we see one of those inspirational prints there on the left side of your screen. Motivated by religious imperatives of mass persuasion, neither Sallman nor Kinkade were modern artists. Warhol, Cornell, Tobey, Pelton, and Rothko, by contrast, drew on their religious beliefs to shape and direct and reinvent modern American art on their own terms. And they utilized journals, diaries, and other forms of writing to qualify their beliefs and often develop their creative works. Cornell, for example, quite literally used books as the sources and containers for multiple art projects. The Joseph Cornell Study Center, part of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, includes Cornell's library of several thousand books. Part of his massive personal collection of things, including thousands of record albums, vintage films, letters, playbills, pamphlets, magazines, buttons, pipes, marbles, compasses, doll parts, seashells, driftwood, cordial glasses, and more. Cornell, who lived with his mother and brother in a modest suburban home in Queens on a street named Utopia Parkway, was an inveterate collector of things, what today we might call a hoarder. And he scoured the bookstalls in the antique stores of Manhattan looking for stuff that he then reused in his collages and his assemblages. Many of his books, for example, are marked cut on their inner flaps, indicating his intention to cut them up and reuse them in various projects. He owned, for example, over 24 copies of the 1951 Golden Nature Guide Stars that we see on the right, and he cut out numerous charts and diagrams from the book. Some of you may remember this book as part of the Golden Nature Guide series, and he cut it up for use in collages and boxes, including this 1959 collage, Fountain of Youth, which juxtaposes John Singleton Copley's Daniel Cromlin Verplanck, a portrait of a young boy painted in 1771, a color photograph of a rainbow arcing over Arizona's Monument Valley, a dove flying above young Daniel's head, and then these 3 diagrams that are clipped from stars. Cornell made a number of book objects in the 1930s and 1940s, including one that transformed mundane French agricultural yearbook published in 1911 into a veritable manual of marvels featuring collages, cutouts, page inserts, altered text, and even, as we can see here, origami. As Dick Rantashian observes, Cornell's alterations overrode the original yearbook's practical application. With its binding loosened and its pages thickened with inserts, the bulky volume was rendered fragile and could no longer have any utilitarian value for reference. Likewise, in this book object of 1940, Cornell inserted a glass and metal coil onto the title page of a 19th century reference guide for French doctors, and then glued together the rest of the book's pages, thus rendering the text unreadable. Fixing a new lens onto the volume, Cornell redirected viewers to gaze into what he implied was the dark nothingness of medical practice. Books were among the vernacular, everyday objects and sources, from irons and urinals, bottle racks, teacups, etc., that interwar avant-garde artists, including Duchamp and the Surrealist, experimented with as they challenged the conventions of art making, the art market, and modernity itself. Cornell's book projects, however, were not just alterations, but corrections, a conceptual and creative mode that stemmed from his religion. Cornell was Christian Science, perhaps best known for its rejection of medicine and the medical establishment. His father died when he was a young man, and his upper middle class family fell into fairly severe financial straits. At age 17, and as the eldest male, Cornell became the family's primary breadwinner, supporting his mother, his 2 sisters, and his disabled brother for the rest of his life. He hated his job as a textile salesman. He was sort of a walking door-to-door salesman in Manhattan. He suffered from chronic headaches, stomach aches, anxiety, insomnia, and depression. A coworker convinced him to seek relief in Christian Science, and after having a significant healing experience, his words, he joined the church, remaining a devout adherent for the rest of his life. Here we see images of the church that he joined and some of the religious ephemera found among his papers. Christian Science is strongly and specifically attached to 2 books, the Bible and Science and Health with the Key to the Scriptures, the textbook written by the church's founder, Mary Baker Eddy. Reading and prayer are the church's primary devotional practices. There are no priests or clergy in Christian Science. The religion centers on the healing ministry of Jesus Christ, whom Mrs. Eddy, as church members call her, asserted was, quote, the way of man's salvation from sickness and death, through its revelation of the inherent spirituality of all existence. She founded her new religion following a bad fall, her suffering unalleviated by medical treatment. Mrs. Eddy turned to a passage in the New Testament and experienced, she later recounted, a complete physical recovery and a profound sense of spiritual purpose. One of few modern women to develop a major new religion, the religion she founded was among the most successful of the early 20th century. We see her here in one of the stained glass windows of the Christian Science Mother Church in Boston. Notably, she's depicted writing, defining her system of religious healing in her repeatedly revised editions of Science and Health. Christian Science is a metaphysical religion that asserts that reality is constituted only by divine mind, which is God or spirit. Matter, sin, disease, and death are considered deviations from the perfection of divine mind and hence illusory. There is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. Matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal. Matter is the unreal and temporal, Mrs. Eddy declared in a scientific statement of being that became a standard in Christian Science church services. Through their religious practice, Christian scientists filter or correct the imperfect, painful, and sinful errors of matter to reach a personal state of spiritual reality or unfoldment that Mrs. Eddy described as, quote, boundless bliss. Cornell repeatedly references this affective state in his diaries and aspired to recapture it in his art. In a series of pharmacies that he made in the 1940s, for example, he filled glass apothecary jars with dried leaves, copper wire, gold paint, butterfly wings, shells, glass balls, colored sand, feathers, chunks of rock, wooden dowels, fruit pits, and lace. Here's another example. Identifying materia medica as incongruous tokens of no curative value, Cornell challenged the efficacy of traditional medicine, evoking Mrs. Eddy's decree that Christian scientists, quote, abandon pharmaceutics and take up ontology, the science of real being. His 1940 book object, a specifically selected medical text with its pages glued shut and a dark coil in the middle peering into nothingness, was similarly engaged in correcting the errors of mortal mind and the illusions then of illness and disease. Now, Cornell's spiritually attuned modernism is not immediately apparent. As with other systems of knowledge that are foreign to us, we need a code to decipher Cornell's art if we're to understand it on the religious terms that I think he intended. And that's where his diaries and journals proved to be helpful. Initially joining Christian Science for physical healing, Cornell parsed its tenets of revelation and watchfulness throughout his life and especially in his writing. Cornell wrote constantly and on whatever came handy, from old receipts and used envelopes to gallery invitations and newspaper clippings. His writing is dotted with references to corrections, clearing, spiritual unfoldment, right mind, as well as to specific passages from Science and Health, the Bible, and CS, or Christian Science lectures. In the 1947 entry on the right, for example, he quoted Mrs. Eddy, from beginning to end, whatever is mortal is composed of material. And underneath the reference from this quote in Science and Health added, antidote to endless procession of mortal claims. Cornell's journalistic practices further reveal how he reckoned with the paradoxical nature of his modern art, with the seeming contradiction between his wide-ranging collecting habits, which he worried about and which others worried about for him, and his religion's dictum that matter is illusory and the only true reality is spirit. As a modern artist who was Christian Science, Cornell responded by making art that focused on the life of spirit and stressed the error, the ephemerality of matter. However dense the materiality of his art, and it is dense, Cornell's subject was spirit. Aesthetic interest in representation, in depicting real-time, real-world things, places, people, and events, or in biography, in reflecting on the nature of the self or himself. These were superseded by the conceptual ideal of an art unburdened by corporality. This ideal was gained in part by engaging modern art practices that undermined materiality in order to establish new realities, especially collage and assemblage. Collage equals life, Cornell wrote in a diary entry, an epithet that I think neatly summarized his modern art ambitions. Described as the 20th century's most revolutionary formal innovation in artistic representation, collage was the stylistic hallmark of both visual and literary moderns, from Picasso to Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams. And I've included just a little bit of a William Carlos Williams poem on the right. Challenging conventional notions of originality, authorship, beauty, and permanence, avant-garde painters and poets alike employed collage's cut and paste sensibilities to rearrange and then represent the forms, the images and words of the known world in alternative ways. Cornell's small collages of the early 1930s, for example, purposely corrected images that he appropriated from other sources to conform to Christian Science's metaphysical logic. In an announcement he designed for a 1932 exhibit at Julian Levy's gallery, for example, he modified this illustration of a young boy shooting darts from a blowpipe with his image of the same young boy expelling the word surrealism, thus replacing, as per Mrs. Eddy, the objects of material sense with spiritual ideas. Likewise, in his untitled collage of a man scrutinizing a spinning coin, Cornell corrected the figure to show him wearing a colander on his head. If anybody actually knows what this kitchen instrument is and wants to share this with me, I'm saying it's a colander, suggesting perhaps the holes inherent in the preoccupation of mortal mind with matter and material things. Cornell's notes and diary entries, and I've had so much fun trying to read through his scrawl. His notes and diary entries recount deep interest in devising a system of modern art that decentered conventional notions of materiality in order to demonstrate revelation, and in particular the revelation of personal experiences and feelings of profound spiritual meaning. Contrary to Charles Simich's assumption, for example, that Cornell was some sort of self-taught naive who worked in the absence of any aesthetic theory, Cornell's diaries divulge an anxious preoccupation with devising a method or idea aside from subject matter. Discussing GC 44, for example, a vast exploration of ephemera that he worked on for over 25 years, and which centered on a part-time job that he had in the summer of 1944, literally 3 months part-time, at a garden center, hence GC 44, in Flushing. Where am I going with this? Discussing GC 44, this vast exploration of ephemera, Cornell described in his diaries and journals over and over again how the portfolio's abundant collection of materials represented a method for crystallizing experiences of exceptional mystery intensity, joy, and delight. GC44's dreamlike accumulation, he reflected, corresponded with, and here is the sort of one view of the spread of some of the material in this exploration, as he called it. GC44's dreamlike accumulation corresponded with standing upon the threshold of the world of authentic visions and being allowed to linger, being plunged into this apocalyptic realm of shining beauty. Reckoning with Christian Science's prohibition of matter and his own problematic habit of material accumulation, Cornell proposed a modern art of spiritual revelation. His interest in ordering and understanding material culture echo Walter Benjamin's massive and unfinished Arcades project, a materialist philosophy of history that excavated Paris's recent architectural past in a collage-style literary form to critique the city's modern state. What we see here is Benjamin in the library in Paris, some of the notes that he took as he put the Arcades project together, and then the cover of a recent book on the Arcades project. Cornell's work also shares affinities, I think, with Warhol's time capsules. Hundreds of cardboard boxes stuffed with personal papers, fan letters, hospital bracelets, wigs, dishes, sketchbooks, Christmas cards, prayer cards, direct mail, bills, receipts, all sorts of stuff that Warhol would just shove into these boxes and pretty much collected and saved from the 1970s until his death in 1987. But Cornell's materialistic explorations cohered around religious rather than historical or biographical concerns. Cornell was not the only American modern whose art was guided by personal religious beliefs. Agnes Pelton, whose early work was included in the 1913 Armory Show. If some of you might have had a chance to see the bits and pieces of the Armory Show that have been floating around both in Europe and also at the New York Historical Society. And interestingly enough, her painting here, The Vine Woods, has been traveling around. She was a follower of Theosophy, a religious movement founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875 in anticipation of a new age of heightened spiritual consciousness. Hence the term New Age, a synthesis of Neoplatonism, occultism, Kabbalah, and certain Indian text. Theosophy's cosmology of a spirit-matter universe centers on harmony, well-being, and self-control. With an emphasis on karma and reincarnation, Theosophy offered an alternative to Western theism and scientific materialism and was an empowering spiritual substitute for the mainstream Christian norms that many American moderns like Agnes Pelton found hollow. Through the early 1920s, Pelton made representational paintings like these. She was a fairly successful New York artist. Her shows were reviewed, her paintings sold, she knew the right people, she was included in some of the more important exhibits and galleries of the day. In 1921, however, she abandoned her New York studio and retreated to a century-old windmill near the Hamptons on Long Island. Living there over the next decade, and you can see her inside the doorway of her little hay mill on the right, she began painting spiritually attuned abstractions like the ray serene, which she inscribed in the reverse, "My first abstraction, not for sale." Theosophy counsels that human wisdom and perfection are attainable at various levels, from initiation to planetary logos, via 7 astral rays, also understood as divine light and celestial powers. For the rest of her career, Pelton focused on these theosophist principles in her abstractions, aiming, as she explained in a letter to her friend Mabel Dodge Luham, to convey her, quote, light message to the world. Again, and these are just some of the examples of her abstractions, she painted hundreds of these. Again, Pelton's diary pages and her journals, also held at the Archives of American Art, provide insights into what her religious beliefs were and how she conceptualized them in her paintings. Moving to Cathedral City, California in 1932, in the desert near Palm Springs, Pelton studied theosophy and sought out fellow believers. She was close, for example, to Loma Land, a theosophical community that Catherine Tingley, a social reformer and editor, built in 1900 on 500 acres of oceanfront property in Point Loma, San Diego. Some of this survives today, but most of it's been destroyed. And as you can see, it was very Oz-like in its architecture. In her small house in Cathedral City, a perfectly named place for her, Pelton built a meditation room and practiced rituals involving incense and trance states, during which she honed her abstractions. In this journal entry we see here, she copied a theosophical passage, this one, that reads, "Spiritual transactions must be translated into the language of mortal senses." And then she wrote underneath, "This is where the form of the natural world must appear in a picture, or can do so, not for themselves, but to convey thought as future light." Pelton repeatedly used symbols of stars, lotus flowers, flames, and especially rays and beams of light to convey various theosophical concepts. More directly, she copied symbolic images from the 1901 theosophical treatise Thought Forms, in which colors and shapes are matched with corresponding emotional and aspirational states. A blue lotus flower with self-renunciation, a winged orange form with high ambition. Her abstraction Night Fires features several of these thought forms, including symbols for jealousy and affection. I end my talk today by observing how many contemporary American artists are engaged in issues of faith, albeit especially on interrogatory terms. And I'm showing here the overall installation view and a detail of the 2005 exhibit Robert Gober had at the appropriately named Matthew Marks Gallery in New York. Gober is a Catholic artist, was raised Catholic. He's also queer, and he works out both of these things, these ideas, in a lot of his work. And you're probably also familiar with the work of Andre Serrano. In the history of modern American art, religion, however, remains largely ignored or viewed with suspicion. While modernism's interpretive range is extensive, with issues of race, gender, sexual difference typically included as salient factors of consideration, studies of the intersections between modern American art and religion remain minimal. I think this is due to several factors, from the lingering effects of Greenbergian formalism to earlier in the 20th century, Pius X's papal decree issued in 1910 that all clergy, preachers, and professors in philosophical theological seminaries must swear an oath against modernism, a practice that actually continued until 1967. At the same time, secularization models of modernity reinforced the idea that religion and modernism, and hence religion and modern art, were fundamentally incompatible. Michael Warner describes the origins of secularization theory in a, quote, potent Enlightenment mythology that regards religion as a primitive remnant. As formulated by Weber and Durkheim, and following a developmental or progressive model of Western civilization, religion was deemed immature, irrational, superstitious, the dark ages before modernity. I'd like to challenge these assumptions by arguing for more efficacious approaches to the cultural work of religion, and more generous considerations of the links between art and faith in modern times. As I hope my talk suggests, all sorts of religious beliefs, helped to determine all sorts of modern art styles, theories, and methods among multiple American moderns. Their diaries and journals can help us as outsiders with little or no direct familiarity with these religious beliefs, understand them, and how they play out in their art. The intersections of art and faith, I think, represent another avenue of inquiry in the field of art history, and I think it'll be interesting to see what sort of research and scholarship is produced in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. I think we have time for a discussion. There's no rush. So please distribute the microphones.
Thank you, Erika. I think I really have to ask you now why you chose as your two examples that you dwelled on most, the two artists whose work is the least modern looking and the most kind of artsy, crafty bricolage of like art therapy. When you, I think that it would clarify your argument if you talked about the visual distinction between them and the other artists whose work you showed, such as Rothko or.
Okay, so perhaps what we're talking about here is differing opinions on what modern is, because I clearly see Cornell and Agnes Pelton as modern artists. I see all of the artists I'm working on as modernist. So my understanding of American modernism is grounded in Daniel Joseph Singel's interpretation of American modernism as perhaps distinct from European modernism. To sum it up pretty quickly, modernism is maybe a structure of feeling, an American preoccupation with flux and fluidity, with change, always with the process of becoming rather than being. There's no particular style, but there are lots of particular methods. Collage, assemblage, montage, the refusal of sort of an academic approach in painting to shading and grounding and representation and figure ground distinction, etc. Craft is certainly part of it. Joseph Cornell definitely considered himself and what he was doing as a modern artist, not a craftsmaker. Agnes Pelton as well. She was trained at Parsons. She studied with, who did she study with? Arthur Davies, also with Holland Day. So she's exhibiting in Knoedler Gallery, etc. So maybe what your concern is this doesn't look modern to me, but I would argue I have a different understanding, an enlarged understanding of what American modernism looks like.
And do you want to comment on some of the other artists that you didn't go in so much detail in?
Haven't done the work yet.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't prepared to talk about Rothko. I mean, I could talk a little bit in a couple of paragraphs about Rothko, Warhol, and Mark Tobey in particular, but I felt more comfortable talking about Pelton and Cornell today, so thank you.
More questions? Yes. Verle.
I believe that Sally Promi's project on art and religion does not want to make the distinction between what's modernist and what is not.
Which is a good move on her part, so. Yeah. No, I mean, there's a distinction to be made between modern and pre-modern, although I'm not sure the Dark Ages is what we have before modern. That's sort of a joke. And my point in talking about that is the secularization theory, which has largely been discounted today because it argues that religion is dead, religion doesn't exist. We know that that's not true. Religion definitely still exists today, and so I'm interested in simply talking about religions around in modern times. Modern artists are religious. Well, let's talk about it. And does religion filter in to the work? Does it shape and direct? And if so, how? So that's my project.
Yes, more questions?
Well, thank you for this, because as you say, religion is a kind of, taboo subject.
It's a taboo,
so,
isn't it?
Yeah, and, you're sort of bringing it nicely. One thing is, is sort of, the methodological, sort of, conceptual premise of what you do, because it's to see the religious sentiment of the artist as, informing the work, or to sort of, explore the religious sentiment and how it's expressed. So I was wondering whether, in a way, the sort of, biography sort of becomes, gains a kind of foreground. And about Cornell, I can't remember when you said he actually embraced Christian Science. So what do you make of the significance of surrealism? I mean, it's a quirky kind of, appropriation of surrealism, but I think that in the early collages, like the Story for Max in View, you have an element of violence, subdued, but it's kind of there. So I would want to hear you on, whether for Cornell religion is also kind of, tactic or sort of, blueprint for repression. And in terms of how you conceptualize the religious sentiment, to me it seems that, faith, in Christianity at least, it's kind of, indissociable from doubt. So whether you'd be looking at this kind of, dialectic in your artists, how, whether faith is actually sort of, kind of, tied up to doubt.
Oh, absolutely. Good question. Good series of questions. Okay, so what I argue in the first chapter on Cornell is that he's influenced or shaped by two big impulses. Surrealism is one, Christian Science is the other. And I say surrealism, and I'm definitely putting him in there because, he walks into Julian Levy's gallery in November of 1931. Levy has just opened, and he's the big surrealist gallery dealer in New York and will be until he closes in 49. And he is immediately taken by some Max Ernst collages. He comes back a few weeks later with some of his own. This is the story. And Julian Levy loves them. And one of them consists of a schooner whose aft sails had been replaced by a spider web and a big rose and a spider web, okay? So, all sorts of things that we can read into this. And he stays with Levy's gallery and a bunch of other modern galleries. Cornell is shown in Art of the Century Gallery. He has modern pedigree. But what he says to Alfred Barr, who's organizing the 1936 Dada Surrealism exhibit, is, I have some problems with some of the surrealists. And what I propose, he uses this phrase, what I propose is a healthier response to surrealism, which immediately I go, the word healthier, science and health, Christian science. This is repeated in the words that he uses and in the Cornell literature. And I just think the pieces sort of need to be put together. But he's definitely a surrealist on his own terms. He also used the phrase white magic. I want to make white magic surrealism instead of all of that dirty, nasty surrealism about naked women kind of stuff. And so his women have clothes on, and they're not usually headless, and they're not having sex, and it's not cute, but it's not about psychosexual fantasy either. So it's a different approach to surrealism. The issue of doubt is fundamental to this project because I think doubt is fundamental to being a modern. And I started thinking about this some time ago, sort of wrestling with issues of faith in general, not my own, but other people's. How do you remain faithful if you're wrestling with doubt? And what I've discovered in sort of working out of religious studies is doubt is absolutely central to faith. One questions oneself every day in terms of, do I believe? Am I believing enough? What are my principles? Am I living up? And almost every one of my artists is engaged in that as well. That's what makes them modern. That's what makes them distinct from a Thomas Kinkade or a Warner Sallman, for whom there is no doubt, because these are fundamentalists who are just straight up proselytizing. So I hope that clarifies the sort of scope of the project. Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to go back to this issue of the relationship between Cornell and surrealism. And I wonder if you have some reflections or ideas about the actual relationship between the notion of spirit that you insisted upon and the notion of the unconscious, which never resists the idea of the body, and therefore of the materiality that, in your reading, Cornell was actually objecting to or replacing with the idea of the spiritual. And the relationship between surrealism and Cornell is, is essential. And it's interesting that he related especially to the women of the group. And in a biography, Dorothea Tanning, that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, insisted on this very modest, very modest attitude of Cornell, and on the idea that they were the ones that he was showing his own boxes to. So he took them to this house where his brother was, and he related to them. So I really, wish to ask you, about this relation of Cornell to surrealism and Levy and also the others, because again, maybe it's sexuality that is the missing part, and maybe, as I heard earlier, the biography maybe provides an answer.
Yeah, right. And in response to both of your points, biography is central to this project. And I'm admitting that I'm not writing biographies because I'm really quite interested in the work itself. But obviously I'm drawing on biography, I'm drawing on journals and diaries in order to parse out how, and as they themselves were trying to parse out, how can I be modern and also be religious? And it's not exactly a straight path at all, and they're experimenting as well, they're modernist. But to your specific question about his women friends or his intimates, he had lots of them, sort of, and he gifted things to them, particularly when he felt that the women in his life conveyed or embodied the kind of spirit or bliss that he felt was in concordance with his own religious beliefs. And one of those was Minna Loy. Another was Marianne Moore, as we heard about yesterday. He was friends with Tanning, he was friends with others, and he would give them boxes, not sell them. He had many problems, and part of what I write about with him and with almost, with the other artist is problems with the market, and how do you sell your religious stuff in a market that's all about things. But Cornell in particular had issues with this, and so he and Tanning exchanged letters, and he would give her certain things, not as much as he did with Loy or some of the other artists. And your question about spirit is it's sort of the central point of this chapter. Some people say, oh no, Cornell's work is all about a closeted queer. No, Cornell's work is all about being a self-taught artist and taking care of a disabled brother. I'm not denying any of that. What I'm trying to work in is that he spent hours and hours in his basement studio where he could get away from the pressures of so many things. And as he was down in his studio working over and over on these boxes, which never were done, for him there was nothing done. It was always creating in a sort of state of flux. In fact, when people would buy his boxes, he would bring them back and say, I got to work on it some more, which really pissed off the collectors in the museums that he would get these back from. Duchamp writes him and says, you've had this box for months. Could you please get it back? The French ambassador wants it back or something. But for him, he repeatedly talks about he repeatedly uses the word spirit in his writing. And I think he's trying to convey it in this paradoxical problem of material. He wants to be an artist. He's not a singer. He's not an abstract artist. He's not a conceptual artist. He's making stuff with stuff. So he has to resolve it. And I think he tries his best.
A lot of what I was going to ask you've covered. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much. This is really very helpful and elucidates a lot. Obviously, I was aware of the Christian Science aspect to his work. So I'm going to, but seeing how useful it is and his reception is kind of amazing. So I'm going to ask a more specific question than I would have. We were talking actually about So one of the cliches in thinking about Cornell's reception is that he's an artist of nostalgia, and he's interested in all of this, vintage old stuff from the 19th century, and we were talking a little bit briefly about how in the Christian Science aspect there's no space for nostalgia, there's no room for that at all. So in a sense, in this particular way and in a general way, I think, could you say more about that, and how more rigorous, some more rigorous attention to his personal beliefs and intentions could maybe correct some of the cliches of his reception in this way?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And Christian Science is really difficult. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who understands the religion or has been a practitioner, but it's not, and I say this, it is not an easily fathomable religion. Mrs. Eddy rewrote Science and Health about 17 different times, so I mean she herself is constantly engaged in what is a metaphysical religion. It's not cut and dry, and it's not mind cure. It's very much about Christ as a healer, so you sort of have to work your way through primitive or early Christianity and then sort of get to her point, which is there is no nostalgia because there's really no sense of the past, the present, or the past or the future. It's sort of now. We live now, we live in spirit. The goal of an adherent is to get to spiritualized consciousness. So not the unconscious, and not dwell on the past, except Cornell does dwell on the past by remembering events that were for him highly spiritualized. That's what GC44 is all about. And then bringing those together in some form, a collage or an assemblage, very personal, as a way of conveying the spirit that is all around us, divine mind. Now, he understands that. Maybe one or two of us understand that. I'm trying to understand that. Nobody else is going to get it. He has to make a living. He sells the boxes. He freely gives the collages away, which is kind of interesting. He gets frustrated by that. He's not uncommon, I think, of so many artists who make with certain intentions and then see their work interpreted on other kinds of levels, and he's very frustrated. So that plays into his belief system as well. He can't name his frustration. He can't even own his frustration because frustration is not a part of the Christian Science paradigm, right? There's no sickness, there's no illness, there's no disease. It's sort of smooth sailing. So I think that as he put it to one gallerist who complimented him on his boxes, he said, "Oh my God." Well, he didn't say that. He said, "Oh dear." It's Erika Doss talking. "You have no idea how hard the boxes have been. I feel trapped, or I've been locked into the boxes." That's what he says. And I feel sorry for the guy. I mean, he says this, I think, in the 50s at some point. But, he's trying to work his way out, both in and out of the boxes at the same time. I know that's very convoluted, but hope that helps. So.
One last question, Liza, I wanted to ask, and we need to stop soon because we have men working here. There's something else happening later this evening. They have to prepare the theater, and we want a cup of coffee before hopping on the bus. So
well,
I just wanted to
sick of talking about Christian Science.
I just want to thank you for a wonderful talk and such an important project. And it just seems, I'm struck by some of Cornell's writings where he almost is in a state of ecstasy with what he finds in his backyard, a leaf or something, the exquisite surprise that he expresses in these writings. He's like an ultra-sensitive person, and it takes on a new dimension when you talk about reality is seen through the mind of the divine in this way. So I think it's a really fruitful.
It's an interesting observation. He was very good friends with Motherwell, and Motherwell made the observation that Cornell was one of the least, I don't want to say materialistic, what did he say? He didn't care about fine food, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't care about his clothes, all right? So he was sort of you know, a lot of people thought he was not quite all there, or self-taught naive. But he was all inside his head. You know, it wasn't about the body or the sensual, perhaps. He was incredibly sensitive to both criticism, conversation. James mentioned the huge lapse in the interview that Catherine Q tried to do with him. That's because he would take 45 minutes to answer a question. You know, he was very much inside of himself. Again, I think that's coming out of Christian Science practice. Very careful formulation of thought. So.
But it does come out in his diary, so.
It's coming out in the diaries, and I also think it comes out in the work. The work is not slapdash, and it gets even more minimalist, as many people have written about in the 50s and 60s. He pares it down, and it becomes cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and more abstract.